The community hall on the naval base wasn't much to look at, just plain concrete walls, a few faded banners, rows of metal chairs, and the faint smell of disinfectant mixed with coffee that had been sitting in an urn for too long. It was the kind of space used for meetings, briefings, and ceremonies, practical and stripped of comfort. Yet on that particular day, the room buzzed with an energy that was equal parts nervousness and pride. Dozens of recruits shuffled in, fresh uniforms still stiff with newness, boots polished so sharply they caught the fluorescent light. Some whispered anxiously about upcoming assignments. Others laughed a little too loudly, disguising nerves behind bravado. They were young, most barely out of high school, brimming with confidence that hadn't yet been tested by reality. For many, this was their first real encounter with military formality beyond training. Into this room walked a woman who looked nothing like them. She wasn't tall or commanding in build. She didn't stride with theatrical force. She simply entered quietly, carrying herself with a calm that drew attention despite her plain appearance. Her jacket was simple, a civilian cut, the color faded from years of use. Her hair was tied back without care for style. She seemed ordinary, almost invisible, yet something about her stillness clashed with the restless energy of the recruits. As she took her seat near the back, a few eyes turned her way. It wasn't her face that caught their attention, but the glimpse of ink that slipped out from beneath her sleeve. On her wrist, dark and faded, was a tattoo, an anchor, entwined with barbed wire. It was crude, the lines not smooth, the style far from the elaborate art young men showed off today. It looked old, weathered, almost primitive. That was all it took for the whispers to begin. "Check that out," one recruit muttered under his breath, nudging the guy beside him. "She's got an anchor tattoo," the other snickered. "What is this, the 80s? Looks like something out of a prison yard. Bet she got it drunk," another added with a smirk. "Probably in some port bar overseas." The group chuckled, stifling their laughter with hands to their mouths as if that would hide their immaturity. Their eyes darted to her wrist again and again, mocking with quiet amusement. They saw an older woman, plain and unimpressive, and they assumed the tattoo confirmed the story they invented for her. A relic of bad decisions, a mark of recklessness rather than honor. She heard them. Of course, she did. Years in the service had sharpened her senses to pick up tone, even when words were whispered. But she didn't turn her head. She didn't glare, didn't respond, didn't even shift in her seat. Instead, she folded her hands calmly in her lap and fixed her gaze straight ahead. For her, this wasn't new. She had seen it before, judgments, cast by eyes too young to understand what they were looking at. Tattoos today had become fashion, decoration, a way to showcase personality. But in her time, ink had meant something else. It wasn't chosen for beauty, but for meaning, for the story etched into the skin. Her anchor, wrapped in barbed wire, wasn't random. It was the mark of survival, the mark of belonging to something larger than herself, the mark of nights where the only thing between her and death had been a choice to keep moving forward. Yet none of that mattered to the recruits. They were still laughing. One leaned over to whisper to his friend, "Bet it's fake. Looks like one of those cheap stick and pokes people do in their garage." The other chuckled. "Can you imagine showing up here with that?" No shame. She still didn't move. Her face remained composed, her eyes steady, her breathing calm. But inside, memories stirred dusty roads and desert heat, the crack of distant gunfire, the weight of injured comrades in her arms. She remembered nights when the world felt like it was collapsing, and mornings when she questioned if she'd live to see another. The tattoo on her wrist had been carved into her skin at a moment when her unit needed a symbol of endurance. It was crude because the circumstances had been crude. It wasn't art. It was survival. The recruits couldn't have known that. They had never carried the weight of silence after a battle, the ache of losing friends, whose names were never spoken outside classified briefings. They didn't understand that a small, faded anchor could hold more history than any metal pinned on a chest. But she understood something else, too. Silence was stronger than rebuttal. If she snapped at them, they would only laugh harder. If she explained herself, her story would sound unbelievable to ears that had never been tested. So she stayed still, choosing to let their laughter echo into emptiness. As the recruits whispered, their confidence grew. That was the way of the inexperienced, to mistake cruelty for strength. They thought they were clever, that their jokes mattered, that their laughter was harmless fun. But deep down, they were children in uniforms, still grasping at the edges of adulthood, unaware of the cost that came with wearing those boots and pledging those oaths. A part of her pitied them. She remembered being young once, full of the same arrogance. Back then, she too had judged what she didn't understand. She too had thought scars were ugly instead of beautiful. It had taken years and pain and loss to learn otherwise. And these recruits would learn too. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day, when the battlefield tested them, they would finally grasp the weight of the things they mocked. For now, she endured. The hall grew noisier as more recruits filed in, the hum of conversation filling the air. Some glanced at her, curious but not unkind, sensing she didn't quite fit the scene. Others ignored her entirely. Yet the small cluster who had first noticed her tattoo continued whispering, leaning toward each other with gleeful smirks. She caught snippets, washed up, trying to look tough. Wrong place. Their words brushed past her like wind against stone. She had been called worse, endured worse. Words were nothing compared to explosions in the dark, compared to the silence of radios that once crackled with familiar voices. Still, as she sat in that chair, the whispers felt like a test, not of her patience, but of her restraint. It would have been easy to let anger rise, to remind them that respect wasn't earned by mocking what they didn't understand. But she chose differently. The best lessons she knew were not taught by words, but by truth revealed at the right moment. And that moment had not yet come. The recruits believed they had uncovered a weakness. What they didn't know was that the tattoo they mocked had been saluted by men braver than they could yet imagine, men who had fought in shadows, whose stories would never be told in history books. The anchor was not a joke. It was a legacy. As she sat in silence, the atmosphere of the room began to change. The idle chatter softened as the sound of heavy boots approached from the hallway. The recruits shifted nervously, suddenly aware that the casual freedom of their whispers was about to end. The presence of authority was drawing near, and with it, the weight of discipline. She didn't move. She didn't smile or scowl. She simply waited, calm as ever. The tattoo on her wrist caught the light once more, a reminder that its meaning would reveal itself soon enough. And when it did, the laughter of the recruits would vanish, replaced by a silence so profound it would mark them for the rest of their lives. The recruits' whispers didn't stop. They only shifted in tone. What began as casual jokes about a faded tattoo soon turned into a deeper, silent judgment about the woman herself. They didn't see a veteran. They didn't see strength. They saw only what their young eyes could process. Someone older, someone plain, someone who, in their minds, didn't belong. She sat still, her back straight, her expression calm, while the storm of small ridicule brewed quietly in front of her. It wasn't loud. No one dared raise their voice in such a formal setting, but she could feel it. Whispered words left ripples, and ripples spread. In the corners of the room, chuckles carried, accompanied by glances that quickly darted away when she turned her head slightly. They judged her not only for the tattoo, but for her lack of visible status. She wore no uniform, no ribbons, no polished boots or insignia that declared rank. To them, she was a civilian wandering into their world, perhaps a spouse or a guest. And the tattoo only reinforced their image, someone who once flirted with rebellion, but had never truly lived the discipline they now prided themselves on. What they couldn't see, what their inexperience blinded them to, was the weight of the years she carried, silently on her shoulders. Every crease around her eyes was earned, every scar beneath her clothing a chapter. The anchor on her wrist wasn't decoration. It was a relic. Faded, yes, but unyielding, like the memories carved into her heart. She remembered when she got it. The air had been heavy with dust and gunpowder. The world then wasn't about comfort or artistry. It was about survival. The tattoo hadn't been given by a professional in a brightly lit studio with sterilized needles and ink sets arranged neatly. It had been done in the field, on rough terrain, by steady hands that trembled only from exhaustion, not fear. They had marked themselves in secret, a bond of those who had stood shoulder to shoulder in places where the ground trembled from the roar of conflict. For her, the anchor wasn't an image to show the world. It was a reminder to herself. An anchor held things steady. An anchor kept you from drifting away. For her unit, it symbolized endurance, when everything else threatened to break. When chaos tried to sweep them into despair, the anchor was the vow to hold firm. The barbed wire wrapped around it was not just decoration. It was a truth. Their anchor was hard-earned. Survival had come with pain, with sacrifice, with scars that wrapped tighter than steel. But the recruits didn't know any of this. They saw only crude lines, an outdated design that carried no appeal. They whispered about how tattoos today were art, elaborate pieces covering arms and backs, detailed with shading and color. To them, her mark was unimpressive, even embarrassing. One young man leaned forward in his chair, whispering just loud enough for her to hear, though he believed she wouldn't react. Bet she regrets it now. Looks like something my dad's buddies had in the 90s. Total mistake. Another laughed softly. She's probably one of those who brags about the good old days, but never actually did anything. Everyone knows someone like that. Her lips pressed together, not in anger, but in restraint. She had no desire to correct them. What would words do here? They would either dismiss her or challenge her, and either way, her truth wasn't something they were ready to hear. These were children cloaked in uniforms, and children rarely listened to wisdom they hadn't earned. Instead, she let their words wash over her, steady as stone against wind. She focused her mind on breathing slow and even, on keeping her heartbeat calm. She had sat in briefing rooms before where lives depended on her composure. Compared to that, this was nothing. And yet, in a quieter way, it was a test. Not of battle, but of patience. She scanned the room subtly, taking in the faces of the recruits. They were clean, unscarred, their eyes bright with ambition. They hadn't yet faced the nights where sleep refused to come, where the ghosts of lost friends whispered in dreams. They hadn't carried the weight of responsibility when the radio crackled with desperate calls for help. They hadn't felt the sting of knowing you'd done everything you could and still lost someone. In time, they would. If they stayed the path, the world would show them its harshness. And then, perhaps, they would look back on this moment differently. They might even remember the woman in the back of the room with the faded tattoo, the one they mocked without understanding. A part of her almost smiled at the thought. Not in cruelty, but in recognition of life's lessons. She had once been in their place too confident, too quick to judge. She remembered dismissing an older sergeant once, thinking his limp made him weak, not knowing he had dragged 3 men to safety after an explosion. She had learned humility that day, in the hardest way. These recruits, too, would learn. But until then, her anchor remained misunderstood. The whispers continued, but quieter now, almost as if the recruits knew their arrogance had limits. Their laughter had dulled, but the judgment in their glances remained. She ignored them still, her silence a shield. She wasn't here for their approval. She wasn't here to be seen. She was here because life had brought her back to the place where it had once nearly ended. The recruits thought the tattoo was a mark of rebellion, of recklessness. They couldn't imagine it as a mark of loyalty, of survival, of grief carried for decades. They had no idea that behind that simple anchor were stories of nights under fire, of missions spoken about only in whispers, of comrades who had worn the same ink but never come home. And so they judged her. But she judged them, too, not with cruelty, but with understanding. She saw their bravado, their arrogance, their inexperience. And beneath all of it, she saw fear. They were trying so hard to belong, to fit the mold of toughness they thought the uniform required. Their laughter wasn't strength. It was insecurity dressed as confidence. She leaned back in her chair, hands folded, her wrist turned just enough to let the anchor show clearly. If they were going to laugh, she would not hide it. The tattoo was not for them, nor for the world. It was hers, and it would remain long after their laughter faded into silence. The room hummed with anticipation now, waiting for the arrival of authority. The recruits fidgeted, tugged at collars, checked their posture. She remained perfectly still. Her stillness alone, though unnoticed by most, carried more discipline than their stiff movements. Her silence was louder than their whispers. The anchor gleamed faintly under the harsh fluorescent light. They still didn't understand. But soon they would. And when the truth revealed itself, the laughter that now felt so bold would die instantly, replaced by a silence that would teach them the respect words never could. The longer the recruits waited for the session to begin, the bolder their whispers became. Nervous energy had a way of spilling into foolishness, and for these young men, the easiest target was the quiet woman seated alone in the back. One of them leaned forward, his voice low but clear enough for her ears. She probably got that thing in some back alley shop. Looks like a scratch job. Bet the ink was free if you bought the booze. The group chuckled, nudging each other like schoolboys rather than soldiers in uniform. Another added, or maybe it's one of those stick-and-poke jobs. You know, a pen and needle kind of deal. Explains why it looks so bad. Their laughter grew, hushed but sharp. She didn't move. Her gaze stayed forward, her posture still. Years of discipline kept her expression neutral. Inside, however, the whispers pulled at memories she hadn't planned to revisit today. She remembered the night that anchor had been etched into her wrist. The air had smelled of sand, sweat, and smoke. The world outside their shelter shook with distant gunfire. They were exhausted, too tired even to speak, yet someone had produced a needle, a small bottle of ink, and a dare born not of recklessness, but of defiance. They needed something to remind themselves they were still alive, still tethered to one another in a place where life could vanish in an instant. The anchor was chosen because it meant stability. The barbed wire was chosen because nothing they endured came without pain. Each stroke of that crude tattoo was pressed into her skin, while laughter genuine, weary laughter echoed in the night, even as death lingered just beyond the walls. That tattoo had never been meant for beauty. It had been meant for memory, for survival, for solidarity. She shifted slightly in her chair, her sleeve sliding back, the faded lines of the anchor catching more light. The recruits noticed, and the snickering returned. Seriously, one whispered, who even gets something like that anymore? Looks like something an old biker would have. Another laughed. She probably regrets it every day. If that was on my skin, I'd cover it up with something better. A third leaned in, smirking. No, she keeps it out on purpose. Probably thinks it makes her look tough. Old people always try too hard. Their arrogance was almost laughable, but she remained composed. She had carried injured men on her shoulders, while rounds cracked overhead. She had patched wounds with trembling hands in places where medics couldn't reach. She had watched the light fade from the eyes of soldiers far too young, soldiers not much older than the boys mocking her now. Compared to those nights, these whispers were meaningless. Yet there was something cutting in their tone, not because of the insult itself, but because it revealed how little they understood. They wore their new uniforms like armor, believing it made them untouchable. They believed toughness was measured by jokes, by bravado, by dismissing what they didn't recognize. They didn't yet know that real toughness was quieter, heavier, and carved into the soul by moments no one would ever see. She kept her silence, her breathing steady. The recruits, mistaking her quiet for weakness, pressed further. Bet she was never even in the service, one whispered. Looks more like someone who tells war stories at bars to impress strangers. The others snickered. She could have corrected them. She could have told them about the nights in Afghanistan, about the missions that never made headlines, about the comrades who had shared her anchor. She could have told them that the very tattoo they mocked had been saluted in places they would only ever read about in classified files. But she said nothing. Not because she was afraid. Not because she was ashamed. But because she knew words would mean nothing to them now. They would only see what they wanted to see, until truth forced them otherwise. Her mind drifted back again, unbidden. She remembered the first time she noticed the tattoo, after returning home. Standing in her kitchen, the silence of civilian life pressing against her ears. She had touched the anchor with her thumb, and felt the weight of everything it represented. The barbed wire, once raw and angry, had faded into a dull memory. But it was still there, binding the anchor in place, reminding her that peace was fragile, earned by blood. Now, sitting in this room filled with young, restless recruits, she saw her tattoo not as a relic, but as a reminder of the gap between their world and hers. They were still untouched by loss. She was defined by it. A sudden burst of laughter from the group cut through the room, drawing a few disapproving glances from others. One of the recruits quickly straightened, pretending innocence, but the damage was done. They had revealed themselves as immature in a place where discipline was expected. She wondered how long it would take for life to humble them. Some would learn quickly. Their arrogance burned away the first time fear gripped them in the field. Others would cling to bravado until it shattered under the weight of reality. Some might never live long enough to learn it all. Her heart ached at the thought. She had seen arrogance before bright, cocky faces that mocked what they didn't understand. Some of those faces never came home. Some were buried with honors, their laughter silenced forever. She carried those memories with her, every one of them, as much a part of her as the tattoo on her wrist. The recruits' whispers finally faded, their attention shifting as footsteps echoed faintly in the corridor outside. The sound was distant, but enough to remind them where they were. Chairs squeaked as they adjusted their posture, suddenly conscious of the discipline expected. She didn't move. She didn't need to. Her posture had been steady from the beginning, her stillness more commanding than their sudden stiffness. The tattoo remained visible, faintly illuminated under the harsh fluorescent lights. To the recruits, it was still a joke, still a relic, still something unworthy of respect. But soon, the truth would reveal itself. And when it did, their laughter would wither into silence, so profound they would never forget it. The recruits' laughter was already fading when the first sound of boots echoed from the hallway outside. It wasn't rushed or uneven. It was steady, deliberate, the kind of stride that carried authority without needing to announce itself. At once, the atmosphere inside the hall shifted. Conversations dropped to murmurs, then silence. Chairs scraped lightly against the floor as recruits straightened, uniforms suddenly tugged tighter, boots pressed firmly together. The whispers, the chuckles, the arrogance of moments before all of it vanished under the weight of anticipation. Every soldier knew that rhythm. Authority was approaching. The doors opened, and in walked a Navy SEAL commander. He wasn't tall enough to intimidate by sheer size, nor did he need to be. His presence did the work for him. Shoulders squared, jaw firm, eyes sharp as glass. His uniform was a quiet thunder ribbons and medals neatly aligned on his chest. The subdued patches of operations most of the recruits couldn't name. Everything about him radiated the kind of respect earned only in places where respect meant survival. The recruits' spines stiffened further. They locked their hands behind their backs, some swallowing hard, their earlier bravado dissolving in his presence. The commander's eyes swept the room. He didn't rush. His gaze landed on faces, lingered, just long enough for each recruit to feel it, then moved on. It was the kind of look that stripped away pretenses. A single glance, and it was as though he knew who had courage, who had fear, who was disciplined, and who was careless. When his eyes reached the back row, they stopped. The woman sat exactly as she had before, hands folded calmly in her lap, her faded tattoo exposed under the harsh fluorescent light. She didn't shift. She didn't flinch. She only looked up, her expression unchanged. The recruits noticed the pause. Their stomachs tightened. Why was he looking at her? The commander's boots struck the floor in a rhythm that echoed like a drumbeat as he began walking down the aisle. Every step deepened the silence. The recruits exchanged nervous glances, their minds racing. Had she done something wrong? Was she about to be called out? They wanted to smirk, to nudge each other again, but the tension pressing on their chests kept them frozen. Closer and closer he walked until he reached her row. Then, without hesitation, he stopped directly in front of her. The recruits held their breath. For a heartbeat, the room stood still, the only sound the faint hum of the lights overhead. Then, the commander raised his hand in a crisp, flawless salute. Gasps broke the silence like glass shattering. The recruits couldn't believe what they were seeing. A Navy SEAL commander, one of the most respected figures in the military, saluting the plane. Quiet woman they had mocked moments ago. Their jaws nearly dropped. Their eyes darted between the two of them, searching desperately for an explanation. The woman rose slowly, her movements calm and deliberate. She returned the salute with a steady hand, her face still composed, her eyes clear. There was no pride in her expression, no smugness at the recruit's shock, just dignity. Quiet, unwavering dignity. The tattoo on her wrist caught the light as she lifted her arm. Suddenly, it didn't look crude. It didn't look outdated. It looked heavy like a symbol carrying the weight of history, of sacrifice, of something sacred that the recruits could neither name nor yet understand. The silence in the hall grew heavier with each passing second. The commander lowered his hand, but didn't step away. Instead, he turned his body slightly, his gaze sweeping across the rows of young recruits who stared at him wide-eyed. None of them dared move. For the first time since they had arrived, the recruits felt something deeper than nervous discipline. They felt shame. They felt the invisible line that separated those who had proven themselves in the crucible of combat from those who had only begun to wear the uniform. And though not a single word had yet been spoken, the truth was already clear. The woman they had mocked was not ordinary. She was someone extraordinary, someone the commander himself honored with the highest gesture of respect. The commander's silence stretched, deliberate and commanding. Every recruit leaned forward slightly, desperate for him to speak, desperate to understand who she was, desperate to know what they had just witnessed. But for a long moment, he said nothing. He let the salute speak first. The recruits' earlier whispers replayed in their minds like a cruel echo, cheap tattoo, drunken mistake, trying too hard. Each word now felt like a weight on their shoulders, pressing harder as the silence grew. The woman lowered her arm, resuming her calm posture, as though nothing had happened, but everything had. The air in the hall was different now, charged, thick with unspoken respect and a new awareness. Still, no one dared break the silence. It was the commander who finally did. His voice was low, but carried effortlessly across the room, each word clear, deliberate, and sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Do you know," he began, his eyes fixed on the recruits, "what that tattoo means?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. No one dared speak. No one dared guess. The recruits who had mocked her stared at the floor, their faces burning, their throats dry. Others simply shook their heads in silence, afraid to even open their mouths. The commander's eyes narrowed, then shifted briefly back to the woman. For just a moment, his stern expression softened, as if he remembered something not meant for words. Then he looked forward again, ready to speak. And with his next words, the entire room would finally understand. But for now, the silence was its own lesson. The commander's gaze swept over the room one last time before he spoke, his voice low, steady, and commanding. Every recruit strained to listen, the air thick with anticipation. The silence was almost unbearable. "Do you know who this woman is?" he began, pointing subtly to the quiet figure in the back. The recruits shook their heads nervously, unsure how to respond. Their earlier mockery felt distant now, like childish echoes from another world. "She is one of the bravest people you will ever meet," the commander continued. "And that tattoo on her wrist is not a mistake, a relic, or decoration. It is a symbol of courage, endurance, and sacrifice earned in the field under circumstances you cannot begin to imagine." A whisper passed among the recruits. "Sacrifice? Endurance?" One muttered, though no one dared to laugh. The woman's hands remained folded in her lap, her posture calm, but a flicker of memory crossed her eyes. She didn't look at the recruits. She didn't need to. She knew what they would feel, and she had already lived through the battles that shaped those feelings. The commander stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly, so that only those in the front could hear clearly. "Years ago, in hostile territories far beyond your training grounds, she served alongside SEAL units during missions that were so classified, most civilians and even some of our own will never hear about them. She stepped into danger willingly. She saved lives when others froze. And she did it with nothing but courage, skill, and determination." The room grew heavier. The recruits' previous arrogance had completely dissolved, replaced by awe and confusion. They had believed the woman with the faded tattoo was nothing, someone to mock. And now, the truth landed like a thunderbolt. The commander's eyes scanned the faces of the young men, ensuring the weight of the moment reached every corner of the hall. "That anchor she bears is not decoration. It is a mark worn by those who have endured the unimaginable. The barbed wire wrapping it represents the hardships she survived, the nights she spent under fire, the comrades she lost. Each line is earned, each mark a testament to service, courage, and sacrifice. You may look at it and see ink, but she sees memory. She sees duty fulfilled, friends remembered, and promises kept." A murmur of disbelief ran through the room. Some recruits shifted uncomfortably, their eyes fixed on the faded tattoo, now gleaming with a meaning they could scarcely grasp. Others simply stared at her, mouths slightly open, unable to form words. The commander took a slow breath, letting the silence settle over the hall. "I've known many brave people in my life," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I've watched men and women perform acts of courage most will never know. I've saluted heroes on battlefields and in hospitals, but few have carried themselves with the quiet dignity that she has. Few have earned respect without asking for it. And that is exactly what this tattoo represents. Respect earned, courage proven, history written in flesh. A recruit in the front row swallowed hard. Sir, we. He couldn't finish. The words failed him. The commander didn't wait for apologies. They weren't necessary. He only continued, walking slowly down the aisle, ensuring that every young soldier in the room felt the impact. When you mock someone without knowing their story, you are judging shadows. You are judging appearances, and you are blind to reality. That is what happened here. You mocked her because you saw only ink. You failed to see courage. You failed to see sacrifice. You failed to see honor. The woman in the back remained calm throughout the speech, her hands resting quietly in her lap. She didn't need acknowledgement. She didn't need to speak. The commander's words, though, made visible what she had carried silently for decades. The respect in the room, the shift in attention, the sudden weight of understanding, it validated years of unseen service. The commander's gaze returned to her briefly, softening just a fraction. She never asked for recognition. She never demanded applause. Her work was done, and the memory of those she served alongside was enough. But today, you will learn to recognize the weight behind symbols you see, and you will remember it. The recruits' heads remained bowed, their faces flushed with shame and awe. They had underestimated her completely, and the realization left them nearly breathless. Some fidgeted, unable to process the truth. Others simply stared, silent, heavy with respect. One of the younger recruits whispered to his neighbor, barely audible, She saved lives?" "Yes," the neighbor replied, equally hushed. "And we mocked her?" The commander's voice cut through the whispers. "Yes, and now you understand. Respect is not given lightly. It is earned through action, sacrifice, and integrity. Judging someone without understanding is the first step toward failure. Remember this lesson. Remember her example." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. The hall was silent, the tension palpable, but not uncomfortable. This was a different kind of intensity, one born of recognition, realization, and humility. Then, he stepped back and saluted her once more. The room collectively held its breath, understanding that this gesture carried the weight of all he had just said. The salute was not ceremonial. It was personal. It was acknowledgement. It was respect at its purest. The woman returned the salute, her movements deliberate, precise, yet unassuming. No emotion broke across her face, but the truth radiated from her posture. She had been seen. She had been recognized. And silently, she allowed herself a fraction of relief, because this time, the room understood, even if only partially, the life she had lived. The recruits didn't move. They couldn't. Their laughter, whispers, and arrogance had vanished entirely. What remained was a profound silence, a kind that reverberates long after words have been spoken. They stared at her tattoo, at her calm demeanor, at the salute exchanged between the two of them, and for the first time, they saw beyond appearances. The commander spoke again, his voice softer now, but no less commanding. "Every mark she carries tells a story. Every scar, visible or hidden, holds history. That tattoo is her story. And today, you have witnessed its meaning firsthand." The recruits lowered their heads, absorbing every word, their previous ignorance replaced with the weight of humility. They had entered the room thinking they understood discipline, courage, and honor. They were wrong. Their lessons had begun too late, yet they were grateful for them nonetheless. The woman in the back resumed her seat, lowering her arm but keeping her posture straight. She didn't need to speak. The room had changed around her. Respect had been established, and it did not need words to affirm it. The silence lingered as the commander turned his attention back to the front, ready to continue the briefing, but the lesson had already been delivered. It was a lesson in courage, in humility, and in the weight of symbols that carry a story far larger than the eye can see. From that day forward, no recruit would look at ink in the same way. They had been taught, in a single moment, that appearances could deceive, and that honor was earned through deeds, not words. And they would carry that lesson with them long after leaving the hall, long after leaving the base. And the woman, quiet as ever, remained a living reminder that true courage needed no applause, only acknowledgement, and sometimes the right person to recognize it. The hall remained silent long after the commander's words had sunk in. The air was thick with unspoken realization, the kind of stillness that feels alive, heavy with gravity. The young recruits, once so confident in their mockery, now sat frozen, their minds racing to reconcile what they had just witnessed. The woman with the faded anchor tattoo in the back of the room had been transformed in their eyes, not by magic, not by stories, but by the undeniable weight of truth. The room had changed. Not physically, of course. The chairs were still metal, the walls still plain concrete, the fluorescent lights still harsh. But the atmosphere had shifted. It was quieter, steadier, more respectful. The laughter and whispers that had once filled the air were gone, replaced by something harder to define reverence. A deep understanding, the kind that doesn't need words. The commander had returned to the front of the hall, resuming his briefing with precision, but the lesson had already been delivered. Every recruit understood that actions and experience carried far more weight than appearances or idle judgment. The woman's presence alone now commanded the respect that words had failed to achieve. A few recruits glanced at one another, their faces pale, expressions uncomfortably honest. "I can't believe we were laughing," one whispered to his neighbor. The neighbor shook his head slowly. "We didn't know. We just assumed." Assumptions. That was the word that stuck. They had assumed so much, and now they were learning the cost of assumptions. Courage, sacrifice, and honor were not evident at first glance. They could not be mocked or judged from appearances alone. The anchor tattoo on her wrist had carried decades of history, and they had failed to see it. The woman remained seated, calm and composed, her hands folded lightly in her lap. Her expression did not shift. She did not glare, she did not scold, she did not boast. That was not her way. Her silence was deliberate, yet it spoke louder than any lecture could have. Every recruit in the room felt it, though most could not articulate why. The woman had taught them a lesson without saying a single word. The commander's eyes returned briefly to her, acknowledging her with the faintest hint of a nod. Respect was mutual, unspoken, complete. The anchor on her wrist, once mocked as a mark of irrelevance, now radiated significance. The story etched in faded ink had been made visible through the power of recognition. As the briefing continued, the recruits' attention shifted, but differently now. They sat straighter, spoke only when prompted, and absorbed every word as though their lives depended on it. And in a sense, they did. What the woman's presence and the commander's acknowledgement had taught them was vital. Respect, courage, and honor were essential not only in battle, but in every interaction. Judging without understanding could cost lives, trust, and camaraderie. Outside the hall, the sun cast long shadows over the base, streaking the concrete walkways with golden light. The noise of distant engines, footsteps, and shouted orders carried faintly into the building. But inside, time seemed slowed. The recruits felt it. Every second lingered longer than it should have, filled with the weight of the lesson they had just received. One recruit, unable to contain himself, finally spoke in a hushed voice. "Sir, we didn't know." The commander didn't turn immediately, but his tone softened slightly. "You didn't know," he repeated. "And now you do. That knowledge is yours to carry." How you use it will define you. The words sank deep. The recruits understood that this moment would linger in their memories, shaping their actions, their judgments, their respect for those who had come before them. The lesson was not temporary. It was permanent, like the ink etched into the woman's skin. Some of the younger recruits stared at her tattoo again, their perception changing with every second. The anchor was no longer a joke. It was a story, a symbol, a testament. They could almost feel the weight of the missions she had undertaken, the danger she had faced, and the comrades she had saved. In their minds, each line of ink began to carry meaning, depth, and history. A few began whispering quietly among themselves, their words respectful and tentative. I never realized. She actually saved lives, really. She really did. The truth was sinking in, layer by layer, dismantling the arrogance they had worn like armor. Meanwhile, the woman's eyes remained forward, almost unfazed, but inside she felt the shift. She had carried her past silently, as she always had. Recognition had never been her goal. But seeing the lesson she embodied settle into the minds of these young recruits, seeing them absorb it with humility, filled her with quiet satisfaction. Not pride, never pride, but affirmation. The sacrifices she had made, the nights she had endured, the fear she had conquered, it had all mattered. And now it mattered to them. The commander continued, emphasizing discipline, honor, and the importance of recognizing courage wherever it might be found. But his words were secondary to the silent narrative in the room. Every glance at her wrist, every realization of the depth behind the tattoo, reinforced the lesson he had imparted. Action spoke louder than words. Experience demanded respect. And some stories required recognition before they could truly teach. Outside the hall, a gentle breeze stirred flags along the base, making them ripple and snap. Inside, the recruits felt a change within themselves. Their arrogance had been stripped away, replaced by reflection and, in many cases, shame. They realized they had been wrong to mock her, wrong to judge based on appearances, and wrong to assume they knew her story without knowing a single detail. And yet, the lesson was not just about her. It was about all of them and all of the soldiers they would serve alongside. Respect, they now understood, was earned through deeds, lived experience, and silent courage. And recognition, when given rightly, could illuminate truths that ignorance and arrogance could never touch. The hall remained quiet as the commander concluded the session, but the lesson did not end with the closing remarks. It lingered in every glance, every heartbeat, every subtle nod. The young recruits now carried the weight of understanding with them, and it would shape their decisions, their conduct, and their perception of courage forever. The woman returned to her own thoughts, quietly reflecting on the moment. She had never sought to impress, never sought applause. Her tattoo had always been a personal reminder of resilience, of camaraderie, and of sacrifice. Yet witnessing the impact it now had, through the acknowledgement of a leader and the changed perceptions of the young recruits, she felt a measure of quiet fulfillment. Her story had reached others, subtly, powerfully, and truthfully. Some recruits lingered in thought longer than others, replaying the scene over and over in their minds, the salute, the commander's words, the stillness of the woman in the back. The lesson was profound, and they understood that while it had been delivered in a single moment, it would unfold over years of service, becoming part of the very way they carried themselves. By the time the session concluded, the atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. The young soldiers left with heavier steps, eyes more observant, minds more reflective. The mockery had been replaced with humility, the arrogance replaced with respect. They now knew that every mark, every story, and every act of courage had a weight that could not be measured by outward appearances alone. And the woman? She remained seated a little longer, letting the silence fill the space around her. She didn't boast, she didn't speak, and she didn't look for recognition. She simply allowed the lesson to settle, knowing that the impact of her story and the commander's acknowledgement would last far longer than a single room, a single briefing, or a single day. From that moment on, the recruits understood that courage was quiet, honor was earned, and some stories, like her anchor tattoo, carried a weight that could teach lessons far beyond what words alone could convey. The hall had returned to its quiet routine, yet the energy inside had shifted profoundly. Where once there had been whispers, snickers, and subtle gestures of mockery, now there was only focus. Every recruit felt a weight on their shoulders, a new awareness that the world they had thought they understood was far more complex than they imagined. They glanced toward the back of the room, where the woman with the faded tattoo remained seated. Her presence no longer felt ordinary. She exuded an unspoken authority, not because of rank or status, but because of her history, her composure, and the actions that had earned her respect in ways their youthful bravado could never achieve. A few of the recruits shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, attempting to process the transformation of their own perceptions. One whispered softly, almost reverently, I can't believe we laughed at her." Another nodded, voice low. "We didn't know. We assumed. We judged without seeing." The words hung in the air, heavy with shame and realization. It was a rare moment, one of those fleeting instances when inexperience collided with truth, forcing introspection. The kind of moment that could define a soldier for the rest of their career. The woman noticed their glances, but said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence carried the weight of decades of service, and the understanding she now inspired was stronger than any lecture could have been. Even the younger recruits, who had been the most vocal in their mockery, found themselves frozen with thought. Their laughter, once so confident, had been replaced by quiet reflection. They replayed the scene in their minds, the commander's deliberate steps, the precise salute, and the unshakable dignity of the woman in the back. It was a sequence that would remain imprinted in their memory forever, a lesson far more lasting than any written instruction or verbal reprimand. One recruit, unable to keep silent, finally whispered a question to his neighbor, as if voicing it out loud would somehow make the weight easier to bear. "Do you think she actually?" "Yes," the other replied, barely above a whisper. "She really did. Every story he told. It's real." The realization struck them harder than any physical drill. Courage, sacrifice, and honor were not abstract concepts. They were tangible, carried in actions and choices, in moments of fear and resolve. They could not be mocked, diminished, or overlooked. The commander, noticing the lingering tension, stepped forward once more. His voice was calm, authoritative, yet softer than before. "What you witnessed here today is not just about her. It is about all of you. The lesson is simple. Do not judge without understanding, and do not mock without knowing. Respect must be earned, yes, but it must also be recognized when it is due. That is the foundation of integrity, the core of leadership, and the essence of courage." His words were precise, and yet it was not his speech alone that left an impression. It was the living example before them. The woman, quiet, composed, her faded tattoo still visible, embodied everything he spoke of. She was proof that actions, not appearances, defined respect. The recruits sat straighter, a subtle shift in posture that mirrored the internal change taking place. Their previous arrogance, the casual dismissal of experience, had evaporated. What remained was a nascent understanding of humility and an appreciation for the lives and sacrifices that had paved the way for their own. A few of the older recruits, those who had seen more, perhaps endured minor challenges in training, looked at the woman differently now. They saw her not as someone to mock, but as a standard, a benchmark. If courage had a measure, She carried it quietly, but unmistakably. If sacrifice had a symbol, it was etched in the ink of her wrist. The younger ones, meanwhile, wrestled with shame and admiration in equal measure. Their laughter had been a defense, a shield against their own insecurities. Now, stripped of pretense, they could feel the weight of their ignorance. And yet, for some, this realization sparked something more powerful, a desire to rise to the level of integrity and courage exemplified before them. The commander allowed the silence to stretch. In that pause, the lesson embedded itself deeper than any spoken words could reach. The recruits absorbed the significance of what they had seen and heard. They understood that leadership was not granted by title alone. Honor was not claimed through showmanship or mockery. Courage was not a badge worn for recognition, but a practice lived quietly, sometimes unseen, sometimes unnoticed, yet always potent. One of the recruits dared to speak aloud, voice trembling slightly. "Sir, will we ever be able to?" His words faltered, incomplete, but the question was clear. Could they ever measure up to the example before them? Could they embody the courage, restraint, and sacrifice that the woman had demonstrated? The commander did not answer immediately. Instead, he gestured to the woman with a nod, acknowledging the truth that needed no words. She remained seated, serene, yet the depth of her experience radiated outward. The implication was unmistakable. Yes, they could strive to achieve the same integrity, but only through action, humility, and endurance. The recruits absorbed the subtle lesson. Admiration without effort was meaningless. Recognition without understanding was hollow. True respect came from living with the weight of responsibility, of facing fear and failure, and choosing to act with courage regardless. Slowly, quietly, the first small shift occurred. Recruits began to nod to one another, acknowledging the truth of the moment. No words were needed. The shared understanding flowed silently, connecting them as a cohort now aware of the gap between youthful assumption and lived experience. The woman shifted slightly, her eyes scanning the room once more. She did not seek validation, yet she allowed the acknowledgement to settle upon her, silently affirming that the decades of service, sacrifice, and perseverance had mattered. The recruits, in turn, began to understand that some lessons were taught not with force, but through observation, through recognition, and through the patience of those who had lived them. The commander's gaze softened slightly, as if he, too, acknowledged the transformation taking place. Leadership, he knew, was as much about imparting lessons as it was about demonstrating them. The woman had demonstrated it without saying a word. The recruits had witnessed it, and now they were changed. By the time the session drew to a close, the young soldiers had undergone a quiet but profound shift. Their laughter was gone. Their arrogance was gone. In its place was reflection, respect, and an emerging desire to rise to the level of example set before them. The anchor tattoo was no longer a point of ridicule. It was a symbol, a living reminder of what it meant to endure, to serve, and to act with honor, even when no one was watching. And as the recruits filed out of the hall, many of them glanced back at the woman, not with mockery, not with idle curiosity, but with recognition. Some offered a small, tentative nod. Others simply met her eyes briefly, silently conveying newfound respect. The lesson of the day would remain with them long after the briefing, long after the walls of the hall faded from memory. It was a lesson about courage, humility, and the quiet power of integrity. It was a lesson about judging without knowing, about seeing beyond appearances, and about understanding that true heroism often goes unnoticed until it is recognized by those who can comprehend its depth. The woman remained seated, her posture calm and her expression serene. She had no need for acknowledgement beyond the quiet respect she had inspired. Yet she allowed herself a small sense of fulfillment. The room, the recruits, the commander, They had all absorbed a piece of what she carried silently for decades. And for the first time in a long while, the invisible weight she bore felt shared, acknowledged, understood. The anchor on her wrist, faded yet indelible, had told its story. And in that story, the recruits found lessons that would guide them through the years to come. Courage was quiet, honor was earned, and respect was never given lightly. The briefing hall was nearly empty now, the echoes of boots and whispers fading into silence. Most of the recruits had already left, filing out with the lessons of the day engraved in their minds. Yet the weight of what had happened lingered in the air, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the moment and would remember it forever. The woman remained seated, her posture calm, hands folded gently in her lap. The faded tattoo on her wrist caught the last rays of sunlight filtering through the windows, glinting faintly as if acknowledging the gravity of the day. The anchor and barbed wire, once mocked, now carried meaning that could not be denied. The commander lingered for a moment, observing the room. He had delivered the verbal lesson. He had saluted her, and yet he allowed silence to linger. Sometimes, he knew, the most powerful lessons were not spoken. Sometimes the example itself was enough. The woman exhaled slowly, feeling the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The arrogance and mockery of the recruits had been replaced with humility, reflection, and awe. Their laughter and whispers had vanished, leaving behind awareness. And although she never sought recognition, she understood the impact she had made. She recalled her journey, the nights under fire, the missions that never made headlines, the comrades she had lost and saved, the countless moments when courage had been her only companion. Each scar, each memory, each line of that anchor tattoo was a chapter of survival and devotion, inked permanently into her skin and her soul. And today, that story had been understood, if only by a handful of young recruits and the commander. The memory of the recruits' initial mockery, now distant yet vivid, reminded her of the fragility of perception. People often judged what they did not know. They dismissed courage, valor, and sacrifice when it did not fit their limited understanding. She had once been that young person, too full of assumptions, blind to the quiet heroism that surrounded her. Time, experience, and loss had taught her patience and perspective. The commander finally spoke again, softly, though the weight of his words carried far. "Remember this day," he said, "not for her tattoo, not for her story, but for what it represents. Every act of courage, every sacrifice, every quiet hero is deserving of recognition. And every time you judge without understanding, you risk losing the lesson before it reaches you." She nodded slightly, though he could not see it. She understood. And the room understood. It was a rare moment when respect transcended words, when deeds were acknowledged by those with the vision to see them. Outside, the base was alive with movement soldiers training, vehicles rolling, orders shouted across yards, but inside the hall, time seemed suspended. The recruits who had left carried the lesson forward in their hearts. They would no longer look at a tattoo or a uniform and make assumptions. They would remember the anchor, the barbed wire, and the woman who embodied what the marks truly meant. As the last echoes of the day settled, one young recruit lingered near the doorway. His eyes traced the lines of the tattoo once more, and he swallowed hard, trying to reconcile the memory of laughter with the reality of courage. He felt a surge of respect, tinged with shame for his earlier behavior, but also a spark of inspiration. He wanted to be worthy not of recognition, but of living with the integrity and courage that she had demonstrated. The woman noticed him pause, then leave without a word. She allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not pride, not triumph, but acknowledgement of understanding beginning to take root, of a seed of respect sown. The commander approached her quietly, standing beside her as he observed the empty hall. "You handled it well," he said, his voice low. They will remember this for a long time. You taught them something they cannot learn from books or drills. You taught them about courage, humility, and honor. She inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. I only showed up, she replied softly. The lesson was theirs to take. I didn't do anything extraordinary. He shook his head gently. It is extraordinary. What you lived, what you endured, and the silence with which you carried it, that is extraordinary. Today, the recruits saw it. Today, they learned it. And that matters. For a long moment, they both stood in quiet reflection. The hall was empty now, yet the impact of the day lingered. Every detail, the salute, the tattoo, the murmurs of awe, the shifts in perception, had formed an invisible thread connecting past and present, courage and acknowledgement, experience and understanding. The woman's gaze drifted to her wrist once more. The faded anchor and barbed wire no longer seemed merely ink. They were history, memory, and a silent testament. They were proof of the lives she had touched, the risks she had endured, and the integrity she had maintained throughout decades of service. Outside, a breeze shifted the flags along the base. The sunlight warmed the walls, the concrete, and the scattered remnants of the day. The lessons learned within would ripple outward through the recruits, subtly shaping their actions, their decisions, and their perceptions of courage. The woman finally rose, her movements deliberate and steady. She allowed the commander to fall into step beside her as they walked toward the exit. The hall, now empty and quiet, seemed almost reverent, holding the memory of what had occurred. Every step they took echoed lightly, yet the weight of the lesson remained. The commander spoke once more, this time more to himself than to her. They needed to see this. They needed to understand. And you made it clear without saying a word. She glanced at him, her expression serene. Some lessons are best seen, not spoken, she said softly. They will carry it with them. That is enough. He nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. It is more than enough. As they reached the doorway and stepped into the fading sunlight, the base continued its rhythm. Vehicles moved, soldiers trained, voices called out. Yet the echo of the lesson lingered, unseen but undeniable. Courage, honor, humility, these were the truths that would persist. And the woman, her tattoo now a symbol not of ridicule but of silent heroism, walked forward with the knowledge that her story had been understood, respected, and passed on in the quietest, most profound way possible. And in that moment, the recruits who had mocked, laughed, and judged would begin their own journeys differently. They would remember the anchor, the barbed wire, the woman's silent strength, and the SEAL commander's recognition. They would carry the lesson into their service, into every challenge, and into every encounter where courage and integrity mattered. The faded tattoo had transformed from ink on skin to a story lived and remembered. It had turned mockery into humility, arrogance into respect, and whispers into silent admiration. It had shown, without fanfare, that true courage is quiet, steadfast, and timeless. And as the woman and the commander disappeared down the sunlit corridor, the hall remained behind a vessel of lessons learned, of respect earned, and of the enduring power of action over appearance. The story, her story, would ripple forward, carried in the hearts of those who had witnessed it, shaping lives quietly but indelibly, like the anchor itself, steady, enduring, and unbreakable.